this is going to be our last class on Uvikashta Misham, and from there you shall seek.
On what?
Uvikashta Misham, and from there you shall seek. Rav Soloveitchik's book on emotional experience of God, the partner to Halach Command we've been working through for a little while now.
This is the last one?
This is the last one on that. We're going to do, next we'll do confrontation and then the holy man of faith. Okay, maybe we started. Sort of sheets in front of Eitan? It should be. Yeah. This class is we're going to sort of race through a lot more, some more text than we usually do, because normally I would have split this into 2 classes at least, but we missed 3 classes in the last month. Plus, who knows how many before that. I don't want to take a break for all of the Pesach break before coming back for one last class of this. So we're going to do the last 2 topics in Uvikashta Misham, which are Devekut and what we call spiritual consciousness.
What's next? What's next time?
Next term, what do you mean? What's next? What are we going to do?
Yeah.
We're going to do confrontation, which is Rav Soloveitchik's book on his article on interfaith relationships and dialogue. Not relationships in terms of romantic relationships between religions, between faiths. We're going to do lowly man of faith, and then depending on how many days we have left, because we keep losing days appearing the last minute. We're going to do tefillah and Zionism. We'll see what else.
Did you, at this point in the year, did you expect us to be ahead or behind of what we currently are at?
Ahead, not tremendously.
So
No, I mean...
Because we had the Segers for months, and we still somehow
No, but every time you guys came out of a Seger, you went on trips and stuff. It's the nice thing about Talmud Torah is that it doesn't actually matter how much ground you cover. The ground and the content is nice, but the point is to be learning.
Yeah.
So the fact that I expected us to have done more is just a function of the fact that you guys also had other stuff to do, and when we learn, we learn. We take time. We don't rush through to the end of things necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
We do sometimes, like today, but not every day.
Let's do this.
Okay, so the last class we were talking about imitatio Dei, about imitating God, which was Rav Soloveitchik's proposal for how to resolve the tension in our religious life. Sometimes we feel close to God, sometimes we feel more distant from God, sometimes we want to be close to God, sometimes we almost feel sort of pushed away from God, what he called the tension between ahava and yira. And he said imitating gives you a way of balancing those. Because imitating for Rav Soloveitchik, imitating God fundamentally means taking a commandment, something that you can obey from a sense of distance, and feeling close to that commandment, feeling like I can identify with this command. I would myself give this command in theory.
Devekut means clinging, right?
Devekut is a hard word to attach. Typically, it's translated as a variety of times. Hard word to translate is translated as a couple of different things often, such as we're going to see it translated in this text as cleaving. To cleave is an English word that means both to split something in half and to stick 2 things together. There's all kinds of words that mean the self and their opposite, both English and in Hebrew. It's like a feature of languages that there will often be a word that means itself and its opposite.
Who writes languages?
People.
What sick human being?
So is it cleave? Cling is another word. Attach is yet another word that's often used for Devekut. I actually personally like devotion to describe the state of Devekut. I think it's the most, the word that most accurately reflects the state of mind expressed in Devekut. We're going to see here how Rav Soloveitchik understands it. So source number 1, imitation, however, cannot be enough. Although the vision of imitatio Dei is distinguished by its glory and power, the road that goes up to the house of God does not end there. But he proposed this resolution, but he actually wants to go past it. It is still possible for the individual to continue his ascent from imitating, you shall walk in his ways, to cleaving. Dialectical love that is cushioned with awe, rises to the level of total pure love. Right? So he wants to go past this sort of balancing a sense of closeness with a sense of distance to sort of just having a sense of closeness. Intellectual yearning to cleave to God appears hand in hand with recoil out of dread in a sort of running back and forth, turning into madness. The madness of absolute love, ultimate and without successor. It is all clinging, all joining, all running toward without running away. Yeah. So what Rav Soloveitchik's goal is some sort of understanding of religious life, the way that you are only attached to God and focused on being attached to God and cleaving to God, and not feeling any sense of distance from God. The obvious sort of problem that presents is that it's not how we ever really experience ourselves. That's where Rav Soloveitchik started, was that our experience is often one of distance. So he's going to propose a couple of models for cleaving to God, for attaching to God.
Closet panentheism?
Well, we're going to get to that, in sort of.
Let's get to the point, I'll come back. I can come back.
But the thing that is going to involve re-understanding those moments where we don't necessarily have an experience of being close with other forms of closeness. So the first one, in this context, I call social Devekut. It's going to be based on a piece from Chazal. But the beginning of this paragraph, I'm just going to summarize. Source number 2.
I'll be back.
Rav Soloveitchik wants to contrast Jewish clinging to God, Jewish attachment to God, with like non-Jewish mysticism, which is interested in negating the individual. That you can unite with God by sort of meditating and have sort of mystical experience where you fundamentally disappear, and all that's left is God. So for Rav Soloveitchik, that's never something Judaism is interested in. Judaism is not interested in disappearance of the individual, and that's clear from a lot of ways, starting with the fact that mitzvot require the existence of like an individual consciousness. But Rav Soloveitchik is really interested in taking this in a different direction, which is that our lives are always not just individual, but also social. So look at this second paragraph in source number 2. But Judaism, directed by halacha, says this is not the way. First of all, one cannot speak of man uniting with God, but only of man cleaving to God. Right? You don't disappear in oneness with God. You sort of attach to God, two things stuck together. Second, man does not cleave to God by denying his actual essence. On the contrary, by affirming his own essence. When the great question booms out, is it possible for man to cleave to God? Is it not written that God is a consuming fire? The mystic's answer is entirely possible, for a fire will come from above and consume man's being, as he is bound to the altar of his love for the hidden one. And the mystics think that when you attach to God, you're sort of destroyed. But our sages of blessed memory gave an entirely different answer. One should cleave to Torah scholars and those who know God's name. That is, one should live a life of value and elevation. Right? So for Rav Soloveitchik, to cleave to God is to attach to and sort of partake in the social sphere of people who are attached to God, people who know God. It's actually like something that goes back to the Sifri, but also it's in a really good example of this is in the Netziv's commentary on Devarim, which is where the command for Devekut comes from. And the Netziv already splits. To some people, what it means to have Devekut is to have sort of constant, ongoing religious experience. But not everyone's meant to have that sort of experience. For the Netziv has this people who are just they're lay people. They're ordinary, so good, maybe like Jews in good standing, but their lives are taken up with communal, with like living with their family, the community, making a living. And so those people, their job is to structure their social circle so that it is constantly involved with Torah and Judaism, that they are, friends with and intermarry with and support people who like dedicate their lives to religion. So that comes sort of from here. This is what Rav Soloveitchik is pulling from. That the Chazal say to cling to God is to cling to those who know His name. And you guys may also recall this from Ravini's Hilchotei Shiur, right? What does it mean? Today is to cling to Yodei Shema, those who know God. But that also leaves the second problem, which Soloveitchik answers in the next piece. As emphasized above, source number 3, the halacha says that one should cleave to those who know Him. In other words, those who know God cleave to Him, and man achieves his goal of cleaving to God by joining together with them. But then the question simply reappears: how do those who know Him cleave to Him? The simple answer is through their knowledge. It is clear the halacha is not referring to abstract knowledge, right? So you say that the goal is to attach to God by structuring your life in a community with people who are attached to God. You just push the question. You think, okay, some people can do that, and some people are somehow attached to God in a different way. So how do they do that? That's going to be the discussion in this paragraph, and a slightly different way in the next section. The simple answer is through their knowledge. It is clear that the halacha is not referring to abstract knowledge, which is of no importance. Study is an important principle when it leads to practice. The pure life in the abstract, without taking on the form of the practical life, is not the aspiration of a halachic man or the man of God. When thought is transformed into will, and will turns into practical action that incorporates loving kindness, justice, and righteousness, then the thinking, desiring, and achieving individual arrives at the level of cleaving to God. When you take your understanding of Judaism and your understanding of halacha and put them into practice, then that active living out of your thought is a model of cleaving to God. And let Him, the glory is glory in this, that He understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who exercises loving kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth. from Yirmiyahu, that knowing God in that pasuk leads to loving kindness, justness, and righteousness. The goal of knowledge is moral action, and so the term "those who know Him" include more than what we see at first glance. Those who know Him are men of God, of achievement and aspiration, in whom study and practice, knowledge and will are blended together in a unified spiritual entity. In reality, this equation of knowledge, will, and action with one another is one of the principles of imitatio Dei. In Him, blessed be He, is revealed the absolute identity of intellect, will, and action. God's word is His thought, His will, and His action as well. By imitating this marvelous identity, man becomes like Him and also cleaves to Him. Once again, coming close to God by imitating Him, and ends with cleaving with Him, walking in all His ways and cleaving with Him. So here he's showing how the line he was drawing between imitatio Dei and Devekut blurs. But the overall point is that you achieve Devekut in this model by either being a person who acts principally, based on your own principles, right? You say, this is what I believe is true in the Torah and in Judaism, and I live based on that. Or you surround yourself with people who do that, right? You live around people who do that and make sure to spend time with them. I think there's sort of an obvious hierarchy there. Meaning, I really think it's better to be the kind of person who lives that principled life. But secondarily, do you still consider Devekut if you just are around those kind of people? I think also presumably the idea is that living around those kind of people and spending time with them will lead you to be a more principled person and live more actively based on your own principles. So that's the sort of social model that Rav Soloveitchik wants to propose. And then here's another one, we'll call it halachic Devekut. It's probably also labeled it halachic and scientific Devekut. And this is going to be more directly Devekut with God in some almost mystical sense. Any questions before I get started? Okay. I'm just going to summarize these first two bits outside. These first bits, Rav Soloveitchik gives a sort of extended explanation. This is, two small paragraphs from an extended explanation of what the Rambam calls the unity of the knower, the knowing, and the known. Have you guys heard about this at all this year so far?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, so this is like an interesting Aristotelian piece that the Rambam is still talking about. It gets picked up in Chassidut, because Chassidut studied the Rambam. So Chabad will talk about it a lot.
Chassidim study the Rambam.
Chabad is so obsessed with the Rambam, you wouldn't believe it.
Isn't he like the most opposite ever?
They don't believe that.
One is that so the best joke with the Rambam is that
They're saying the same thing.
there's Maimonides, but also your Maimonides and his Maimonides and her Maimonides, because Rambam was sort of intentionally as obscure as possible in a lot of places, so people can interpret him in all kinds of ways. Second, though, we've said this before, there are ways, depending on how you define mysticism, Rambam might very well be considered a mystic. Right? He doesn't have a richly metaphysical world with all kinds of miracles going on all the time and worlds that we can't see and whatever, but he's deeply concerned with union with God and with religious experience. These are features more of mysticism and of meditation. So Chabad meditating on ideas, the Kohit Bonanut, is actually a very deeply Rambam idea. There are definitely differences. I don't think I would necessarily agree with all Chabad's readings of Rambam, but they're very deeply attached to Rambam. Less to the Moreh, but there's some to the Moreh. Chassidut actually studied the Moreh Nevuchim more than you'd expect, and medieval Jewish philosophy, but a lot of it is studied among Chassidut. But Chabad is particularly interested and focused on the Mishnah Torah. It's like most Chabadnikim finish the Mishnah Torah once a year.
That's halacha.
What? It's halacha, but it's still the Rambam, and it includes plenty that is not halacha.
Yeah.
The distinction between the halachic Mishnah Torah and the philosophical Moreh Nevuchim doesn't actually hold up in a lot of ways. The Mishnah Torah is very philosophical.
I see.
So the Rambam has this idea of the unity of the knower, the knowing, and the known, which essentially is the idea that if you think about the way knowing works, when you are thinking about an idea, that takes up all of your mind. You, in that moment, are the thinking, and you're thinking about this object, and your thought is not separate from that idea. There's a sort of overlap between the person thinking and the thing about which they're thinking in that process of thought. Right? So in that moment of knowing, the knower and the known overlap. That's important for Rambam because he thinks that we, on our deepest level, are just intellect, or just our minds, that's the sort of the pure truth of who we are, and that the goal for human existence is to unite with truth and true ideas. So that's really the goal of human life for him, is to experience that moment, that unity. Rav Soloveitchik is not as concerned with that, because he's much more concerned with willful action and halacha and life in the world and things like that we've spoken about. But he still takes this model of the subject, the thinker, uniting with the object about which they're thinking. He's going to use that for Devekut. So source number 6 is going to talk about how you can have Devekut with God through thinking. The act of creation is, in essence, an intellectual act of the Holy One, blessed be He, as God of the world. Right? So how God has, Rambam describes God knowing the world through knowing Himself. God's revealed knowledge constitutes the existence of the world. The lawfulness of nature is the uncovering of the supernal will from its closed off infinity. God, one of the first classes in this book, we talked about the importance of creation, meaning that God is in fact revealed through the world. He is the source of being, its essence, and its purpose. The all is included within Him. On this line is for you. God's knowledge of the world is the knowledge of His truth. His essence is as the makom of the world, as the first and last existence who contains everything, encompassing and filling all creation. The world is the object of God's knowledge. It is rooted in its subject. The known cleaves to the knower forever and without pause. Right? So Rav Soloveitchik has sort of deeply embedded the world within God in the process of saying that God created the world as a manifestation of His own thought process and is constantly thinking about the world.
But probably the most sort of Aaron or Soloveitchik one.
Just about. That means that based on that principle of the unity of the knower and the known, that God and the world are fundamentally united constantly. If you want to talk about them being separate on some level, this would suggest that they're actually united.
So Devekut's a mindset that just is, according to Rav Soloveitchik, is already existing in reality.
Let's go forward. So far, that has suggested there's a sort of constant unity between God and the world.
Yeah.
But let's see what he says next. On the one hand, the Holy One's knowledge of the world is identical to His knowledge of His absolute true existence. On the other hand, one who apprehends the world, who identifies with the world, and through it with the truth of His existence, His being God. At the same time, the world also constitutes the object or thing that is apprehended by the apprehending individual. This follows that man is united with the world, since the principle of identification of knower with the known also applies to the realm of the limited, discontinuous human cognition. And thus emerges from this assumption that the world is the object of both God's knowledge and human knowledge. A remarkable conclusion, right? If God understanding the world sort of is united with the world, the same is also true for human beings. You can also be sort of totally enmeshed with the world in the process of thinking about it and trying to understand it. And for Rav Soloveitchik, that essentially creates an overlap, right? There's now a Venn diagram of the world, God, and humanity, and as long as you are trying to understand the world and pondering the world, then that takes you to a place where you and God are sharing the same sort of cognitive space. This is in addition to being the most of Aaron that the Rav Soloveitchik gets, is also sort of the most Rambam Rav Soloveitchik gets. That Rambam is very says how do you understand God? How do you know God? What is Moshe learning when he learns the Yudil Midah of Rachamim, sort of a peak experience of God for Moshe, is exactly that, how God runs the world, the way God is manifest in the world. Which on the most basic level means you should study science, and there's something sort of divine in studying science.
Rambam says things about science that he was just saying what he thought in the time.
Yeah.
Some of the things in Mishnah Torah, the sun, the earth, I can't remember exactly. His understanding was wrong.
Yeah, meaning there's two different issues there. One is what is specific scientific statements, and the idea of science as the process of trying to understand God's world, right? So Rambam's understanding of the world was wrong. Rambam was one of the best scientists, or maybe from natural philosopher would be more accurate, his time, of his day. Rambam was against, did not believe in astrology, despite the fact that most philosophers of Rambam's day believed in astrology. It's kind of random that he didn't. But he still lived in the 1100s.
Why didn't he believe in that?
I'm not sure. I don't know why not.
Wouldn't it follow his other thought stream? His other sort of.
Yeah.
It's not like he has he's not like a communist in all the issues, but when it comes to healthcare, he's suddenly a capitalist. Like he's,
Right, no, so he is being consistent when he says no to astrology, but he doesn't have to be. He could have affirmed astrology and made it work. The Ibn Ezra does that. Ibn Ezra is very rationalist, but also deeply into astrology. Same thing with the Ralbag, actually. The Ralbag is in many ways much more, considered more of a rationalist than Rambam. Like he's much even more disenchanted of a world, less interested in miracles than Rambam. But part of that is that he believed more in causation and causality, and that the stars were part of that. So, like Rambam is ahead of the game in science when it comes to astrology. That's probably why he doesn't have a crater on the moon named after him. Because definitely Ralbag and I think also Ibn Ezra have craters on the moon named after them.
the Rabbah have craters on the moon.
Definitely the Ralbag. I think also Ibn Ezra. I'm not 100%.
What's the crater? What's it called?
Something to do with Gersonides.
That's his English name, Gerson.
Yeah, so Ides is the
Why are they all?
Ides is the Greek suffix meaning son of, right? So Rambam is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon in Hebrew. Ben Maimon is Maimonides. Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, the Ramban, Nachmanides. Rabbi Gershon, Gersonides.
I don't know how to spell Gerson.
Gersonides.
Gary?
Okay, top page 3. Put differently, by knowing the world, the individual knows his creator and cleaves
French
to him.
philosopher. Yeah.
Man apprehends the world and becomes one with it. God knows the world as the truth of his own existence. Man and God are united in knowledge of the world. Right? I actually think it's like just a cool idea. That even if you don't want to get into the question of like, is it mysticism, is it uniting on some level? Because the point is that like God is constantly knowing the world. There's pretty much no Jewish definition of God that doesn't have God constantly knowing the world and thinking about every aspect of the world. So by pursuing that, by studying the world and trying to understand it better, not only are you imitating God in some broader sense, you are actively involved in the same pursuit that Kaviyachol God is actively involved in, whatever that means. That there's some unity of project, at the very least, if not also the metaphysical unity Rav Soloveitchik is talking about. Source number 7, and here he pivots, fascinatingly, from knowledge of God in the world to a different kind of knowledge of God. The contemplation and morality, what is and what ought to be, are blended. And that's what he said before, right? Knowing and doing are blended. True thought is also moral. Thought equals will. The moral will is the essence of cognition. Both of them are revealed in the continuing creative act. So when the individual apprehends the world, he directs his cognition out of a lofty moral goal and translates his cognition and volition into a mighty act. He unites himself with the world he has apprehended, and through the world he cleaves to the Holy and Blessed be He. Okay, so that's a lot. But it's basically saying that when you understand the world, you also gain a perspective on the way you think the world should be. There is, in fact, impossible to know something without also having a sense of how things should be. So that the same way God created the world with some sort of moral purpose in mind, when we know the world, we also gain a moral sense, and we share that with God. For surely the world's existence is rooted in the thought of the Holy and Blessed be He, and is the thought of absolute truth and infinite moral will, which is in all action and creation. Yeah. The same expression of the unity of the knower and the known applies not only to the knowledge of His primordial will, the let there be of Genesis, which is constant sensible world manifested in its order and continuity, but also to the halachic understanding of the relational command. That the same way they're saying that when you understand the world, you gain a sense of the way it should be. God's knowledge of the world is accompanied by God's revelation, the sense that there is a way the world should be. It's something that people living in the world should live up to, which is the standard of halacha. To join finitude with finity, and how characteristic is that our sages distinguish two aspects of the fulfillment of the command to love God, whose purpose in essence is cleaving to Him, contemplating the acts of creation, and contemplating the Word of God, which appears in subjective form at the various branches of halacha. So the final form of Devekut for Rav Soloveitchik is contemplating halacha, because the same way that you can contemplate God's sort of knowledge of the world by contemplating the world, you can contemplate God's revealed will and God's knowledge embedded in the Torah by studying Torah and halacha. And here, this is something he talks about more explicitly in Halachic Man we talked about. He's working off of the Tanya. The Tanya, various places throughout the Balatany's writings talk about the Torah as God's chokhmah, God's wisdom, embodied in some sort of physical form, and what you're doing when you're studying Torah is sort of wrapping your mind around God's, as it were. That the Torah is a concrete instance of God's infinite mind given to us for the purpose of our ability to encounter God in it. Because you can't encounter the infinite and totally transcendent, but you can in the limited form of the Torah. So Rav Soloveitchik is essentially invoking that on some level. That the way that Torah functions not just as a guide for our action, but also as a sort of place of Devekut, as a space to meet God in the kelim, in the vessels, the concrete instantiations of the words of Torah and the conclusions of halacha. So that's Devekut. That's sort of the end of this theoretical pyramid that Rav Soloveitchik builds, going from the ground up of our own basic urges to find God in nature, in culture, to seek the transcendent, to going from there to experiencing something outside ourselves. He calls revelation that manifests in the revealed law, the laws that stand outside of our own personal whims and desires. The attempt to balance those to sort of opposing forces through imitating God and sort of trying to identify with this revelational command, to the idea that once we have these revelational commands, we can study them constantly and through them be attached to God, and through God's world be attached to God, and through living principally, living in a principled manner, be attached to God. From there he makes a sort of the concluding section. He calls it spiritual consciousness. He's gone from natural consciousness to revelational consciousness to spiritual consciousness. And there he lays out three principles, what does this look like in practice beyond the sort of theoretical discussion he laid out. Those three aspects he calls the rule of the intellect, the elevation of the body, and the perpetuity of God's word. Any questions before we start on those? Alright, so this we're going to do again briefly, at least for the first two a little more briefly. They're relatively simple ideas, I think, and one of them we touched on before, and it's pretty popular, and the perpetuity of God's word we'll get into a little more in depth. So source number 2 in this section, and this would have been a separate class had we, a longer separate class if we had more time, but kacha. What is the rule of the intellect? The special importance that the halacha bestows upon reason is so salient that it symbolizes the entire character of the halachic approach. Intellect is the final arbiter in all matters of law and judgment. The content of halacha, whose essence is revelational, is subjugated to the essence of rational cognition. Studying the Torah is a cognitive occupation like any other intellectual activity. The only authority is reason. The halacha expels from its realm all mysterious obscurity, whispers of intuition that are beyond rational cognition, and even supernatural revelations. I think it's a powerful and fascinating paragraph, because it's very often not how Rav Soloveitchik is thought of, certainly not how often his students portray him. Because this has nothing of authority in it. There's no who gets to decide what halacha is here. There's no, you have to listen to these authorities and those authorities. No, when it comes to halacha, it's about who makes the best argument. Right? Halacha is, rabbis say in Hebrew, halacha mitkabel ahadat. Halacha makes sense. Right? So once you know halacha, if you can make the best argument, you're right. This is totally sort of non-hierarchical. Because for Soloveitchik, halacha is in many ways primarily, and as we're saying here, primarily an intellectual activity. We're going to see he does talk about the importance of Masorah, of tradition, which is by definition hierarchical. But for him, the importance of Masorah is not in it's not here. It's not in the establishing of halacha. It's not in saying, okay, you think this is right, but you have to submit your own understanding. And if you can make the best argument for halacha, that's what matters. A prophet who expresses his opinion on matters of Torah law in the form of prophecy is punishable by death. The background of the law is revelational / apocalyptic, both the written and the oral Torah, which were given to Moses at Sinai. But the swirl of colors painted upon it is cognitive and natural. We receive halacha in some sense from God, some basic degree of it, and then it's entirely a function of human creation after that. Right? Halacha man goes on at length about human creation and the ability to be creative in halacha, and that's the entirety of halacha man. And then one footnote mentions, of course, the principles from which halacha man starts are received from God at Sinai. But once you have those principles, then the game is entirely human. Human thought, which is subject to the principles of logic, has dared to penetrate into and occupy a realm that does not belong to it. The freedom of inquiry and investigation in the field of halacha is enormous. Torah scholars have to deduce new ideas from old ones, create new and original concepts and specific methods, and delineate distinct realms of thought. There is no change or reform within halacha, but there is unlimited innovation, right? This is a subtle argument because you can't be orthodox after the 1800s and talk about reform or change in halacha because you sound like you're not orthodox, and orthodoxy defined itself as against non-orthodox movements. So he's distinguishing between change or reform on the one hand and innovation, chidush.
I can't really understand. Like it's like the head. What was the thing called? The way you can loan money.
The prosbul?
Prosbul. And the heter, the one that lets you do shmita.
Heter mechira.
Heter mechira. Like they're clearly against like the original idea. Is halachically acceptable? Yeah, maybe, but it's clearly against the original idea. So we can't say that halakha teaches us some sort of virtue now. If
Rav Soloveitchik,
what do you mean?
so, say halakha is trying to teach us the virtue of forgiving.
So I think
And then shmita, and then no.
yes and no. Meaning this is exactly the question of like chidush comes in, or application of halachic principles to new realities comes in. And prosbul is a really good example of it. The argument about what prosbul is, and there's all kinds of different arguments about like how Chazal had the power to create this realm of prosbul. Lots of discussions of it include the intense phrase "Oker devar min haTorah," that Chazal uprooted something from the Torah, which is crazy. But the fundamental logic of it is that prosbul had begun to serve its opposite purpose. Right? If you're talking about trying to teach us a value, right? Prosbul is about you should be lending to people, and then, the underlying idea is shmidat ksafim, of returning money to people, right? Is that people should be able to not return money. When people borrow money, they have to pay it back until Shemitah. Then the person who theoretically could claim that money can no longer claim it anymore. After Shemitah, you can't claim people's debts, right? So that's the basic rule from the Torah. The reason for that is pretty clearly like people need money. It's just a fact. Sometimes people need money. And that shouldn't be something that comes back to haunt them. That people should be able to borrow money and they have to pay it back. It's a moral responsibility. But if they can't, eventually that doesn't hang over their head anymore. And the fact that you are like, if you're so poor and you've so unsuccessfully you can't pay it back, that shouldn't make things even worse for you. That seems to be the underlying idea between Shemitah and Ksafim. The problem is that by the time the Hillel came around, people weren't lending money anymore. Because they're saying, if I'm going to have, or at least at the very least close to Shemitah, they weren't lending money anymore. Because like if I'm going to lose my ability to claim this debt, I don't want to make the loan to begin with. Which means people weren't, like who needed to borrow money, weren't getting the money to begin with.
No, I'm talking about this.
Yeah, so like in that case, I think it's like very clear. Prosbul is an attempt to maintain the underlying idea in a new reality where the underlying idea was or the original application of that idea was no longer functioning.
When they were doing this, was that biblical, did they use the Orayta sources?
I don't even derivate the sources. Like, this is clearly a chidush. According to many understandings, Oker devar min Torah uproots the Torah, and it's a machloket. Like Yishalmi, the Bavli, Septa, all the Rishonim, why exactly they're able to do that? What's the definition? I don't want to talk about it now. A, because it's a whole other topic. B, because it's like a whole topic that I would need to review. I haven't learned in a couple of years. But it's like it's both absolutely clearly a chidush and an attempt to maintain that value. Sorry, I hope that's satisfying enough for now. Halachic thought, rooted in the revelational foundation, cannot control its own postulates, as does scientific thought. It has to accept them as they are. Nevertheless, halachic thought too enjoys great, marvelous freedom. There is a combination here of two contrary elements. This is again the love and fear, back and forth we saw, the freedom and compulsion. The revelational and the rational. Revelational consciousness is absorbed into cognitive consciousness with innovational thinking. The Holy One, blessed be He, gave the Torah to Israel and commanded us to innovate and create. And sort of classical Rav Soloveitchik, dialectical or almost paradoxical, command to be creative and spontaneous, the command to come up with your own things. That for Rav Soloveitchik, like halacha and Torah thought and learning is absolutely like starting from things that are given and then just seeing where you can go with that. So that's the elevation of the intellect, so the rule of the intellect. The body, I'm going to read this quickly. What is the elevation of the body? Here, Rav Soloveitchik also wants to contrast this with like Christian sort of mysticism and other things that are more denigrating towards the body. But he says, what is the elevation of the body? It is the entire Torah. Everything else is interpretation. Judaism is almost entirely involved in real bodily existence, its physiological functions. The subjects of the halacha are the parts of the human body. Halacha aims to sanctify man's body, refine the bestial aspects of human life with all their lusts and drives, and raise them to the level of divine service. But this refining process does not take place in a crucible of denial and deprivation. It occurs by stamping the natural aspects of human existence with a direction and purposefulness. Combining the beast in man with his divine image purifies and sanctifies the body. This union is accomplished by imposing the yoke of halachic commandments on the body. The purpose of halachic imperative is not to label man's sensual body as impure and thus rejected, but to purify it and draw it close to God. The halachic factor, when applied to pleasure-filled, self-satisfied fleshly existence, an existence driven by untamed instincts and made insensitive by savage lusts, bestows the glory of the Shekhinah on the human body. Halacha enjoins man from hysteria of desire and madness. And enjoins mean like warns away. The sort of pleasure that halacha recommends avoids excessive intensity, stimulation of the nerves, and intoxication of the senses. Instead, it has the beauty of the refinement and splendor of life's aesthetic elements. When man takes pleasure in the world in accordance with the view of halacha, his pleasure is modest and delicate, an enjoyment which avoids the mania of sexual desire and the frenzy of gluttony. I've actually skipped the passage here that I've left out where we looked at, back talking about creation consciousness, how Rav Soloveitchik sees like brachot actually increase your enjoyment of things. You make a bracha on them first. Like talking about the real appreciation of enjoyment. Because one of the things I really appreciate with these passages I've brought here is that Rav Soloveitchik doesn't make here the kind of apologetic element you hear sometimes people like saying, oh, Judaism is the religion that like champions the body, that sort of totally loves the body. It's making like a balanced argument here that like, look, the truth is, halacha, by definition, means that you have to, you cannot obey all of your bodily impulses. So the halacha definingly tells you what to do with your body, and so your own impulses are not the overall, the arbiters of what's right and what's wrong. He's differentiating people who think that like you should fundamentally be trying to ignore your body. And the best example of this within Judaism is Rambam, who like would really love it if we could get away from our bodies. He says multiple times throughout the Morah that like bodies are bad, sense of touch is shameful to people, stuff like that. But he also wants to say that like this is not Rambam. Rav Soloveitchik wants to say like this is what halacha is focused on. If you do a sort of balanced approach, and that ends up somewhere like the Greeks called hedonism, the hedonism of like the skeptics and the Epicureans, which is that like you should be enjoying life, but enjoying life means doing so in moderation, like having a little bit of good things, as opposed to like a total sort of frenzy of sating all of your desires. And for Rav Soloveitchik, it's because there's something aesthetically beautiful about this, and fundamentally because halacha's command. Whereas for the Greeks, they're like, look, if you go on a bender, binge drinking and eating everything you want, you're going to be sick and probably die. But for Rav Soloveitchik, no, this is halacha wants us to have this sort of beautiful, balanced life, and that is with every aspect of ourselves, including our bodies. And quickly do. Sorry, we're basically done here time-wise, but I want to quickly talk about the perpetuation of God's word. I'm going to summarize these first two outside. Rav Soloveitchik essentially invokes again this idea of the uniting of the knower and the knowing and the known, but here in a slightly different vein. He talks about the chain of the tradition, the Masorah, which he invokes at the end of this second paragraph that we're going to skip, to talk about the how we get to where we are now from Moshe and the Nevi'im. Because if the person is always deeply involved in the knowledge they know, then prophets are always deeply involved in the Torah they pass on to us, and what the Nevi'im said to Bnei Yisrael, how Bnei Yisrael received from them, and how it's been passed on to generations. Each person in a chain of Masorah, in a chain of learning and teaching, deeply embeds themselves into what they are teaching, and also, therefore, also appreciates it from their teacher. Right? This is for Rav Soloveitchik, you can basically invoke a selach harav. You have a rabbi, right? What it means to have a rabbi is to have someone where you can sense them in their teaching, and you're aware of it and appreciate it, and at some level internalize aspects of them from their teaching, which is why it's important to not have unethical teachers, right? So the line in Malachi that compares the Kohen teaching Torah to a malach, and the Gemara says don't ever learn from someone who's not like a malach, right? Don't learn from someone who seems to be a problematic person, is an immoral teacher. So for Rav Soloveitchik, this means that everyone in the Masorah should be deeply engaged in the Torah, for that they teach and that they learn. And this creates the chain of the Masorah, a chain of relationships between prophets and Bnei Israel, between teacher and student throughout the generations. I go to paragraph number 6. About 2/3 of the way down, in the middle of the line, it says the community of Israel, in quotation marks.
Yeah.
So I'm going to finish off here. The community of Israel means the coupling of the first and last generations of prophet and listener, Torah teacher and disciple, the revelation of the Shekhinah in the dim light of the dawn, and the vision of the end of days at the appointed time. The individual and the community must come together through an act of historical identification with the past and the future, the fate and destiny of the Jewish people. And this is also an idea he invoked in the last command about the transcending death, transcending time, having a sense of eternity and belonging to the Jewish people. Here it's through being a participant in the chain of Nevuah and Torah, both receiving Torah from real people teaching it and teaching it forward, teaching it into the future. That's another theme that's going to emerge when we get to Lonely Man of Faith as well. The individual and the community must come together through an act of historical identification of the past and future, the fate and destiny of the Jewish people. The vision of the beginning and the end is constantly being renewed and joins the individual and the community from past generations of Knesset Yisrael with those to come. Thus can the individual cleave completely and absolutely to God, an attachment that no longer involves either flight or retreat. This is his final concluding words of Ubikashta Misham, is that the key, final model of connecting to God and being connected to God is participation in the Jewish people as an embodiment of a living community of Torah, people who live Torah but also learn Torah from their predecessors and teach Torah to those who come after them. So I think it's a good note to end on before Pesach, the Chag that celebrates exactly all of those things, being part of the trans-historical Jewish people, the two different generations coming together to talk about that. Is there any other questions? Yeah, great. Thank you guys for a great Zman. I'll see you next week.
Thank you very much, Rob.